Hi, 3JS. It's Miss Solomon, and I'm back with Mr. Popper's Penguins. I bet you missed this book. The chapter I'm reading today is chapter 19, Admiral Drake. So Mr. Popper, with Captain Cook, Greta, Columbus, Louisa, Nelson, Jenny, Magellan, Adelina, Scott, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria, was bundled into the patrol wagon and hustled off to the police station. None of his pleas could make the desk sergeant move. That theater manager is pretty mad at the way you busted into his theater, so I'm holding you. I'm going to give you all a nice quiet cell, unless you furnish bail, which is to mean provide money to get out of jail. I'm putting the bail at $500 for you and $100 each for each of the birds. Of course, Mr. Popper did not have money about him. Neither did Mrs. Popper when they telephoned her at the hotel. The hotel bill was paid for several days ahead, but she had no cash. The check for the final week's salary was not due until the end of the week. Indeed, it now looked as if the Poppers would never see the check, since they could not get the Penguins out of jail long enough to put on their act at the Royal Theatre. If only they could get in touch with Mr. Greenbaum, Mr. Popper knew that the kind man would have got them out of jail. But Mr. Greenbaum was somewhere in Hollywood, out on the Pacific coast, and the Poppers had no idea how to reach him. It was very dull for the birds in jail. Wednesday came, and there was still no word from Mr. Greenbaum. Thursday, and the birds began to droop. It was soon apparent that the lack of exercise, combined with the heat, might prove too much for them. There were no more tricks or merry games. Even the younger birds sat all day in dismal silence, and Mr. Popper could not cheer them up. Mr. Popper had a feeling that Mr. Greenbaum would probably turn up by the end of the week to see about renewing the contract, but Friday passed without any news from him. Saturday morning, Mr. Popper got up very early and smoothed his hair. Then he dusted off the Penguins as well as he could, for he wanted everything to look as presentable as possible in case Mr. Greenbaum should appear. About 10 o'clock, there was a sound of footsteps in the corridor and a jingling of keys, and the door cell was opened. "You're free, Mr. Popper! There's a friend of yours here!" Mr. Popper stepped out into the light with the Penguins. "You're barely in time, Mr. Greenbaum," he was about to say. Then, as his eyes became accustomed to the light, he looked again. It was not Mr. Greenbaum who stood there. It was a great bearded man in a splendid uniform. Smiling, he held out his hand to Mr. Popper. "Mr. Popper," he said, "I'm Admiral Drake." "Admiral Drake!" gasped Mr. Popper. "Not back from the South Pole?" "Yes," said the Admiral, "and the Drake Antarctic expedition ship returned yesterday. You should have seen the reception New York gave us. You can read about it in today's paper. But I read about the trouble you were having over the Penguins, and so here I am. I have a long story to tell you." "Could we go back to the hotel and talk about it?" asked Mr. Popper. "My wife will be anxious to see us back." "Certainly," said the Admiral, and when they were all settled in the Popper rooms at the hotel, with the Penguins clustering around to listen, Admiral Drake began. "Naturally, when I knew that I was coming back to America, I often thought about the man to whom I had sent the Penguin. It takes a long time to hear things down there, and I often wondered how you and the birds were getting along. Last night at the mayor's dinner for us, I heard about the wonderful trained penguin act that you had been putting on all over the country. This morning, I picked up the paper, and the first thing I read was that Mr. Popper and his 12 penguins were still being held in jail. But 12 penguins? Mr. Popper, how on earth?" Then Mr. Popper told how Greta had arrived to keep Captain Cook from being lonely, and how the little penguins had grown, and how the clever little band had saved the day for the Poppers when things looked bad. "It's amazing," said Admiral Drake. "I've seen a lot of penguins in my time, but never such educated ones as these. It certainly shows what patience and training can do. But now, to get to my real point, Mr. Popper, you probably know that I have explored the North Pole as well as the South Pole." "Oh, yes," said Mr. Popper respectfully. "I have read books about both your Arctic and your Antarctic expeditions." "Well, then," said the Admiral, "maybe you know why we explorers prefer the South Pole." Could it be on account of the penguins, sir? Asked Janie, who had been listening very hard. Admiral Drake patted her head. Yes, my dear. Those long polar nights get pretty dull when you have no pets to play with. Of course, there are polar bears up there, but you can't play with them. Nobody knows why there are no penguins at the North Pole. For a long time, the United States government has been wanting me to lead an expedition up there for the purpose of establishing a breed of penguins. I must come to the point, Mr. Popper. You've had such remarkable success with these birds of yours. Why not let me take them to the North Pole and start a race of penguins there? Just then, Mr. Greenbaum and another gentleman were announced. They shook hands all around and were introduced to the Admiral. Well, Popper, said Mr. Greenbaum, too bad about the mix-up over the theaters. But never mind. Here's Mr. Klein, who owns a colossal film company. He's going to make you a fortune. You'll be a poor man no longer, Mr. Popper. Poor, said Mr. Popper. I'm not poor. These birds have been earning us $5,000 a week. Oh, $5,000, said Mr. Klein. What's that? Pin money. I want to put those birds in the movies, Mr. Popper. We've got the story department working on stories for them already. Why, I'll put each of those birds under a contract that will keep you and the missus on Easy Street for the rest of your lives. Papa, whispered Mrs. Popper, I don't want to live on Easy Street. I want to go back to Proudfoot Avenue. You say those men at the North Pole get lonely because there are no penguins? Asked Mr. Popper. Very lonely, said the Admiral. But if there were penguins up there, mightn't the polar bears eat them? Oh, ordinarily penguins, yes, said the Admiral judiciously, but not such highly trained birds as yours, Mr. Popper. They could outwit any polar bear, I guess. It was now Mr. Klein's turn to speak. In every moving picture house in America, little children would have the pleasure of seeing stories acted out by the Popper performing penguins, he said. Of course, if we succeeded in establishing the breed at the North Pole, said the Admiral, the name might have to be changed a little. I imagine that hundreds of years from now, scientists would be calling them the Popper Arctic penguins. Mr. Popper was silent for a moment. Gentlemen, he said, I want to thank you both. I'll give you my decision tomorrow. And that is the end of chapter 19. And tomorrow is chapter 20. And it's called Farewell, Mr. Popper. So tomorrow we will find out Mr. Popper's decision. And for now, we will be in suspense. Have a great day. Bye, guys.